Welcome everyone to the Inside Line F1 podcast. Now, before we begin properly with the Spanish GP review that you've been looking forward to, I just want to give a special message to everyone in Mumbai because yes, we've had another cracking event last time out at Dadar Social for the Spanish GP with veteran F1 journalist Abhishek Takle joining in. We had an amazing pre-race interaction with all of our attendees and also a fun post-race review with an F1 simulator there as well and a very special quiz by F1 Stats Guru. And we're planning to do more of these. So for the Canadian GP, stay tuned for more of this because we'd really love to engage with you and have a fun community interaction with everyone in Mumbai as well. So for more information, you can check out the links in our description to follow us on social media so that you can be updated. But trust me, these events are going to be a lot of fun and a lot more of them are coming soon. Now, back to the episode.
So the 5 red lights illuminate and we go.
Iconic. This never gets old. And this is going to be so amazing. This entire next hour where we folks have Steve Slater, the voice of Formula One in Asia over the last couple of decades. And he's going to be on the show to talk about all of our Canadian GP stories and more, including our thoughts on the 2023 F1 season. Wow, strap yourselves in because this is going to be a fun hour coming up. Welcome everyone to the Inside Line F1 podcast. My name is Samal Arora. I'm the host of the Indian Racing League broadcast on Star Sports. And this time, as I mentioned early on, the legend himself, Steve Slater, is joining us once again on the Inside Line F1 podcast. And Steve, firstly, thank you so much for taking out some time on a Sunday morning to talk about some racing. And when you put it that way, it sounds almost perfect.
What could be better? An English summer's day just outside the window. I'm heading to an airfield to fly vintage aircraft a little bit later on. And we get to talk about racing cars for an hour first. This is as good as it gets.
Yeah, that's more like it. If only the current season was as good as it gets, though, because we've been watching Formula One over the last, wow, it's been 6 months since the year has begun. So 3 months since the season has started? And since then, right, there's been such an overload of racing because there's a race happening every other week. But not everyone seems to be best pleased by the action going around. So have you enjoyed watching your racing so far, or is it just the aircraft that has kept you entertained over the last few months?
No, I've been enjoying the racing. Yes, it's been a season dominated by Red Bull Racing. There are technical reasons why the Red Bull appears to have the advantage over Ferrari. Mercedes have rather dropped the ball. They tried their aerodynamic approach, which they struggled with last year, and have failed to execute properly this year. And there's some fairly significant changes at Mercedes as a result of that. And we're seeing the car now suddenly gaining side pods. They're almost back at their pre-season test point now. So they're going to come back stronger in the mid part of the season. You've got McLaren, who have been good in parts, but with actually a much smaller budget than a lot of the other teams. Aston Martin, one just wonders how many $1 million the Stroll family are spending to get themselves there. But they do, and Fernando Alonso, it's got to be said, Fernando is enjoying his motor racing. I love the comment somebody said, now you're in your 40s, but how long are you going to continue? He says, well, show me a younger driver that's faster than me. And then Ferrari. Well, yes, Ferrari sort of makes you want to throw things at the television quite often, doesn't it? Because they've got so much potential, but manage to find a way of stalling it every time. And it's interesting that Ferrari really haven't made some of the steps forward. I don't know whether you saw there was speculation this week that the senior Ferrari management of the Ferrari company had actually briefed the design team to actually increase straight line speed, because you can't have a Ferrari being beaten by a Mercedes on straight line speed. But that's compromised them for their aerodynamics, for cornering. And perhaps if Ferrari's management hadn't meddled for marketing reasons, the Ferrari might be a more competitive car.
Well, are we all the way back to the to the mid 20th century when Enzo Ferrari used to have this mindset as well, that it doesn't matter what the aero is, build a fast straight line car. But I heard a lump in your voice when you were talking about Ferrari and just the emotion that surrounds it. Is it the same for Fernando though? Because I think, Steve, we've never seen this person ever. We've seen a certain person named Fernando Alonso who can drive race cars very, very fast, but this is a different human being. Did you ever see these sort of signs with Fernando back in the day when you ever met him?
I think he was always a winner. He's never a guy that if you walk to a doorway, who would say after you. Most Formula One drivers are like that, it's got to be said. When I first started working with Alonso, it's 20 years ago now, he was a very arrogant individual, was quite hard work to do interviews with and things like that. I think he's matured, he's grown up. He's got other things in his life as well. But the simple fact is, he is still a fantastically quick racing driver, and he could transfer that to Le Mans. He could, where he was on the podium, he could transfer that to IndyCar, where he actually led the Indy 500 a few years ago. Didn't win it, but he's got the pace. He could jump into pretty well. You could give him a supermarket trolley, and he'd be first through the doors with it.
It's amazing. But what do you reckon about his whole paternal side? It's a little odd. Like, he's finally grown up at 41.
And why not? He knows he's in the last few years of his Formula One racing career. What he will do next, I don't know. It's got to be said, there's never been great, with possible exception of Niki Lauda, there's never been a great history for F1 drivers successfully running teams afterwards. It seems it's a different skill set. Alan Prost had a darn good go, but his team, of course, went into liquidation at the end of it. We've seen the odd one in the past, but I don't know, whatever Alonso do, it'll be worth watching.
And Steve, what do you reckon about the title challenge at the top, if there ever is one, with Sergio Perez in that regard? Because our friend F1 Stats Guru on the podcast revealed that now Sergio Perez has to overcome the record for the biggest points deficit ever overcome by a driver in a season to win a world title. I think Perez is at 53 points. Max did it last year at some number around the 40s. So do we even have a fight, or is it game over already?
I wouldn't say it's game over already. Red Bull are committed to fair racing between their two drivers. In a way, it allows Perez potentially to win a few more Grand Prix, because there won't be a pressure on the team to say we need every individual point for Max, because Max is already in such a strong position. I mean, Max probably could go off on holiday for the rest of the season and still be world champion. But that's not the way it's going to work. The simple fact is that Max Verstappen, the current Red Bull, and the team that's around them are the dream package. It's like the Michael Schumacher Ferrari package of sort of 2005, 6, something like that. That is exactly what I think it should be. And there's a simple answer to everyone that complains that Max Verstappen is dominating. Find somebody to go beat him. My apologies, Samuel. I've just lost your audio. Oh, you just
there
back
we are.
again now.
No. It's so silly, actually. It's been, 3 years since COVID, and we all sometimes forget to mute our microphones off as well. But before we get to talking about some other drivers that have really intrigued us, firstly, I'd also like to welcome all the live audience members who are also joining in right here. Folks, you can say hello on the chat as well. Send in your questions for Steve, and we'd really love to answer them. And genuinely, thank you for taking out your time on a Sunday afternoon / morning, and hopefully evening as well, if we've got listeners all over the globe as well. So genuinely, thank you for joining in.
Yes, I've just enabled the chat, so if anybody does the whisper backstage, I'll pick up on
it. Awesome. But Steve, I also want to talk about a few interesting points about the season. I want to know your takes on how this goes as well. Firstly, the broader regulation part with the sliding scale aerodynamics and the budget cap. It seemingly allowed a minor or rather a small team like Aston Martin to jump up the ranks very, very quickly. But do you think it's working overall so far? And do you like how this whole new modern generation of Formula One's turning out to be?
I think, yes. I mean, it's got to be said that Red Bull Racing last year were caught playing fast and loose with the budget cap. If I remember rightly, they were fined. It's the limit's 140 million, I think it is. It dropped down to 135 million for this season. And if I remember rightly, Red Bull Racing were fined about $7 million for breaching that budget cap last year. And that could easily be one of the reasons why their car has such a significant advantage over Mercedes, although I think a lot of that is Mercedes having made errors in the way they've dealt with it. It could be the reason why Ferrari are struggling to catch up, though, because they did comply with the rules. And Aston Martin's a fascinating one, because bear in mind, this is the team that just a few years ago were Force India, and just a few years before that were Jordan. They've made an absolutely immense investment in what they're doing. And it's a great support for the Aston Martin brand around the world. And being British, I'm personally very proud of what Aston Martin are doing as the premier British sports car brand. And, yes, it's owned by a Canadian, but it's still very much a British brand. If you buy a Rolls Royce, you're basically buying a BMW. If you're buying a Bentley, you're basically buying a Volkswagen. But if you buy an Aston Martin, you're buying something that's the only other British sports car that's similar is the Morgan, which is still built to a 1946 design.
And it's so beautiful. And especially the three-wheel Morgans as well. The way they just drive around eventually, what a sight.
Well, I was very lucky to have 6 years of driving a Morgan, and I loved it to bits.
What?
One day when I can afford it, I might well have another one.
Okay, Steve, at some point you really have to tell me more about the experience of owning a Morgan. But in fact, we've actually got questions from all of our live audiences as well.
Yeah.
And this is first one from Priyansh. And by the way, Priyansh, thank you. Thank you so much for taking out the time to join us right here. He's got three of them actually, and three really incredibly fun ones. Firstly, on Sergio Perez. And it's a harsh one, isn't it? Do you think Perez is the right choice for Red Bull Racing? And do you think his own interest? What about his own interest? Is he the right person to continue for Red Bull Racing in that second driver role? And what do you reckon about it, Steve?
Well, I'll take you back to Felipe Massa, where Felipe said, well, what do I do? Do I leave and drive an inferior car? At the end of the day, he's got the same car as Max Verstappen. He's paired with what is clearly the best driver in the world at the moment. I would think for Sergio, his challenge is to get himself into a position, and he quite often is able to do it, to get himself into an F1 car that is in the car. He's got to match Max, and that's got to be the great, because at the end of the day, your teammate is your best possible challenge, and they're doing it in the best cars. Is he going to be world champion one day? Probably not, but he's going to win a few more Grand Prix on the way, particularly if anything goes wrong for Max.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how it's turning out to be. But Priyansh has actually got another one on Ferrari. And this one, oh boy. How do you feel Ferrari can get back to the top? Is the Leclerc-Sainz pairing the best one going forward? And the change at the top hasn't really helped them with the strategy level. They still end up making the same mistakes. But I sort of disagree, isn't it, Steve? Because I think they make new mistakes all the time.
Yes, exactly that. They seem to find new ways of losing races every time. And it frustrates me because I am passionate about motorsport, and you can't not be passionate about Ferrari. Anybody who listens to a classic Ferrari going past down the road, if their pulse rate doesn't rise, they ain't got a pulse. And the F1 cars, the F1 cars all sound a bit the same. In Ferrari at the moment, you've got a team which is finding its feet. I get the impression that at some point Ferrari will start focusing on 2024. And you may well see that they won't improve any further, because why spend another $10 million trying to make your car go quicker for this year when you might want to ensure that it's going to be quicker than Red Bull next year? And I think that could be the next decision that Ferrari's management team have to make, is when do they say, right, okay, we start focusing on the next season. They've also got to keep Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc interested. Both of those drivers would be snapped up if they came on the driver market by, say, a Mercedes or an Aston Martin. I think that, somebody once said to me they were offered a seat at Renault, and he says, look, I've got a choice between driving for Ferrari and getting a Ferrari company car, or Renault and getting a Renault company car. Which am I going to choose?
You know what? Daniel Ricciardo actually got the Renault Twizy, that small little two-seater car that they actually had as one of his company cars as well. So
Yeah, the one I loved was back in the days when Mercedes, if you won a championship for Mercedes, you were given a vehicle from their production line, any vehicle you could of your choice. And I won't name the driver, but they asked for a luxury coach
A luxury coach.
because it was the most expensive thing on the Mercedes product list, which you could then sell.
What a guy.
That was clever.
1 second. It can only be so many drivers, can it?
Not naming, no names, no pack group.
Oh man,
It's also a little bit like when Honda F1 were based at Brackley in England. They offered most of their senior engineers any choice of any vehicle in the Honda range. What they hadn't expected was that they nearly all their engineers got Honda Blackbird 1200 motorcycles,
yes.
which were capable of about 200 miles an hour. So their entire engineering team were engaged in the highest, riskiest thing to do on the road.
That's precisely what you do, and that's the benefit of working for a company like that. I mean, who would go out there and ask for a Honda Civic or something like that, would you? It's oh, but goodness, Renault needs to step up their game with the company cars, by the way. I think it helps that they're Alpine now, and they have at least the A110.
Yes, exactly. I think that's one of the advantages of being Alpine. Those Alpines are fun, actually. They're a good car.
Have you driven them, Steve? I really love to know.
I've driven the small engine one, and I liked it.
Oh,
I thought it was a really nicely balanced car. It's not a Porsche. It's very different to a Porsche, but I can't afford one, I hasten to add. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's what, £50,000 or something thereabouts?
Yeah, it's a lot of money for a car. I'm happy with the ones I got.
It looks beautiful. It really does look beautiful. But actually, on the discussion of Ferrari once again, we've actually got a question from Kevin that's coming in that's also on the same point as well. Do Ferrari need some person like Aldo Costa to join, or is he the guy who knows Ferrari? Because he's the guy who knows Ferrari and the person who brought Mercedes success as well. Do you think it's a management thing? And have they made enough changes recently to sort of...
I think they've probably made enough changes recently. They need to bed the team in. And I've now just had a mental block, and I can't think of the name of the great French guy who's running the team at the moment. Fred. Yep. And he is a racer, absolutely at heart. And he is also a very good manager. He's the sort of guy who can pull a team together, and that's what they need at the moment. So I don't think more management. The only thing with Fred must be he must start. If Ferrari management are meddling, he won't be comfortable with that. But what I would say is, at the moment, I think the Ferrari just need to get their feet on the ground and start building upwards. The other team that's going to be interesting to watch in that respect is McLaren. Because they actually have got quite a small budget. They're not as heavily funded as some of the other teams around F1. We're still talking $100 million rather than $135 million. But you're looking at a lot of money, but it's not at the same level as some of the others. And I do think actually McLaren are probably now capable of delivering what I would call the best bang for the buck in Formula One.
But Steve, before we get to some of the other questions that all of our dear listeners have sent in live, I just want to ask one thing about McLaren, about how has it gone so pear-shaped so quickly? Because I think we remember 10 odd years ago when, luckily you were in the commentary box, McLaren used to have such an amazing technology department. It used to have a great spend and investment on R&D. And sure, they didn't get success over the last decade and a half, and they had a little bit of financial trouble during COVID. But surely the Formula One department is a different thing, right? So how did they not become one of the key spenders in Formula One over the last few years?
They bear in mind that in 2011 they lost their Mercedes-Benz investment and budget, and probably lost 40 or 50 million a year, which had been previously invested from Mercedes, and they had to rebuild a team, and they have to make a team that shows a profit. It's at the end of the day, it's an independent team now. It's like Williams or the Alfa Romeo team. They're all teams that have to show an independent profit. The Alfa Romeo naming on their car is not particularly a direct development budget from the car manufacturer. It's a sponsorship, which is why they're going to move relatively seamlessly to another brand name in a year or so's time. So I think that McLaren are in a similar situation, and they've got a great factory and they've got a great team of people there. And they are separate, of course, now from the McLaren road car division. That's a separate activity. But it is a smaller budget and a smaller team. But actually, as a smaller team, they are capable of regularly running at the front. And I think particularly with Lando Norris there, you're going to have more podiums coming up as the season goes on.
Yeah, actually, let's stay on McLaren for 1 second before we go to other things as well, because there's one from Ajit who's actually sent in a really fun question. Why is it so difficult for McLaren and Williams to get into a podium position nowadays? Is it just the budget or related to skills of the driver and the team? And there's also, I think there's one from Ankit as well that I just saw a second ago.
Yes.
That was also based on a similar point as well, which was on McLaren. Have they lost the game? And I'm just sort of loading it up because I can see it. Yeah, have they lost the game with...
No, I've seen it. Have they lost the game with losing the Works Partnership tag? And thanks for that one. I think that it's not that they've lost the game, but they've had to restructure. And having no longer being part of a major car manufacturer's investment program, you've got to then structure the team, and Zach Brown has done a fantastic job, and he's doing the same thing actually with IndyCar teams as well at the moment, with his McLaren IndyCar team and with his Formula E and Formula E off-road racing. So he's got a lot of fingers in a lot of pies. Ultimately, he came from the finance sector in New York. He knows how to raise finance and to generate business models, and that's what he's doing with the McLaren F1 team. They've got one very good driver and a second very good new driver who's learning the ropes with every successive race. So I personally think that the future looks good for McLaren. And as I say, they're the team that's probably set to deliver the maximum points for the dollar over the next half season. I've lost your audio again.
There we are. I have made the same mistake again in the second, in the last 10 minutes. But okay, let's actually now also get back to Canada, because that's essentially what we're here for. And there are so many other questions, especially two of them from Mayur that we'd love to answer. Firstly, he's got one about your time commentating about your favorite race and favorite duel. But Mayur, rest assured, we will get back to that. But we need to also speak about the Canadian GP for a second as well. Because Steve, this one is, I don't know how people just don't sort of rate Canada in the top 1% of all the Formula One Grand Prix all the time. Because for me, when I look at it, it's a lot like heading into an Indian restaurant and ordering kebabs. Even though you're sort of there for the tikka masala, the kebabs will never, ever disappoint you. And that's what the Canadian GP has been like for the last 30, 40 odd years at least.
Well, I have to say that this Canadian Grand Prix, we've had moments of genius and we've had moments of drama. We've even sadly had a moment of tragedy back in the 1990s when a track marshal was killed there. But Canada, back in the early 2000s, you have to remember that it was the only Grand Prix on the North American continent. You know, we had Brazil and we had Canada as the only two Grand Prix on that side of the Atlantic. With the new Netflix generation of viewers and everything else in the United States, obviously we've now got 3 stateside Grand Prix. And in fact, it'll be 4, including Canada. So it's moved to being part of a market rather than being the only one on the North American continent, which has probably had a big effect on Canada. Also, before some of the city Grand Prix came in, before Baku, before Singapore, Canada and Montreal was the only Grand Prix circuit you could at that time get to on the tram or by bus or by the metro. So you didn't, if you were flying in as a visitor or as a tourist, you didn't have to go and rent a car and drive up into the Ardennes Mountains or something like that. So that's another great thing. It's a fantastic location. It's the I'm trying to think, Ile Exposition. It's the island in the middle of the river, which was basically created and reclaimed to host the Expo 67, the World Exposition. And some of the old Expo buildings are now like Art Deco icons, are still there. They're, 50-something years old now. So it's a great place to visit. And Montreal is, for those that haven't visited Canada, Montreal is part of the French-speaking area of Canada, which is still very pro-French. They've never quite forgiven us for the Brits for having sort of taken over the rest of Canada as a dominion. But you've got French catering, you've got great people, and a real attitude in the city, and you get that when you get there. It's a good place to go, even if there wasn't a motor race on.
And they actually had quite a bit of wildlife also, didn't they? They had... No, wait, I was about to say hedgehog, but Sonic is a hedgehog. But they actually had tiny little groundhogs, didn't they, at the Montreal circuit?
Groundhogs. Yeah, they're sort of like a rodent. I've never got close to one, but they do tend to come out from burrows that are dug into the sandy soil on the island. And particularly by about Sunday, they've gotten brave because they've gotten used to the people being around, and also because the people have left a little bit of litter around and food, so because they're foragers, so they'll come out foraging unless they get scared away by people. And there's a lot of work done actually to try and seal off the area around the track to prevent animals crossing the track and things like that. But it does occasionally happen.
There have been so many clips of them actually running in the middle of the circuit during a Formula One race, to the point where it's actually scary. But now that we're on the subject of very Montreal-specific things in Formula One, let's not forget, we used to have, and now we also have once again, the legendary Canadian GP raft race, where Formula One teams actually compete against each other in a raft race in the middle of an artificial lake on the Canadian GP island, the Ile Notre Dame. Have you ever had the chance of going there, Steve, and witnessing for yourself?
I'll be honest with you, I was too busy working to get to the raft race. But interestingly, in my Star Sports period, we never were trackside for the Canadian Grand Prix because the budget to fly the production commentary team out, pay for the commentary facilities, fly everybody across the Atlantic was just too high. So we actually would do that particular race from a studio in London. And myself and Karun, or myself and Chris Goodwin would spend a lot of time on the internet and on the phone, catching up with people. And then, but basically, though, once the race starts, your job as a commentator is to interpret what the TV camera is showing you, not to say, "Well, I'm looking out the window." And I was very happy with what we did. What I would say is that this race and the Spanish Grand Prix, which I'm glad that last weekend's Spanish Grand Prix was such an interesting race. But those two races were the ones where I bring the most notes into the commentary box. I used to normally start a Canadian Grand Prix with 24 pages of notes because there were going to be lengthy periods where there was nothing to talk about. So I would prepare notes and prepare information so that we could drop some of those items in when there was nothing much going on the track. Because unfortunately, Canada can be quite processional. Somebody once said it's long periods of not a lot happening, followed by an awful lot happening in a short period of time. And of course, we did have the record-breaking one, didn't we? Was it 4 hours 39 minutes? Where that was the 2011 race when it rained. And it still went down to an overtaking move on the last lap when Jenson Button passed Sebastian Vettel. Sebastian Vettel half-spun his car on the last lap of the race while he was leading. So you can't say the race was without interest, but I do recollect we had Stump Steve going on Twitter, and it's the only time I ever trended on Twitter because so many people were coming in with questions for me live. So that was how we filled. That was how we filled in nearly 2 hours of rain stop.
Oh, that one. What a legendary race that was. I remember distinctly that you folks were on air for more or less 4 hours roughly. But still, it was so entertaining during the rain break as well. And even before and after that, because Jenson Button had just all the chaos in the world. The guy started somewhere in the upper midfield and then had so much of chaos, had so many crashes, so many incidents, so many pit stops. And even then, the fact that he came up on the last lap and forced Sebastian Vettel into an error. What a race. I think it was very clearly one of the best races that I've ever watched in my life. And it must have been such a memory for you folks covering it on the ground.
Well, yeah, I mean, Jenson was about mid-distance, I think it was like 39 or 38. He bounced off the back of Fernando Alonso. And he then had a puncture. He then had a stop-go penalty, and he was dead last. Yet in all of those changing conditions, he came back through the field, and then Sebastian Vettel, poor man, dropped it on the very last lap, did a half spin. Jensen drove through to take the victory. That was pretty impressive.
What a comeback that must have been. I mean, to be taken off the Formula One radar for that horrific injury that he had, that also, by the way, gave Sebastian Vettel his chance to sort of take part in a Formula One race for the first time ever. And then after that, coming back a year later and taking his BMW and Sauber's only ever win in Formula One. What a story that must have been. But on the subject of Robert, Steve, I've heard from so many people that back in the day, he was actually paid as a young kid to drive around and test karts because he was just so good that his feedback was very, very valuable. Do you think there's any merit to that story?
That doesn't surprise me. I never thought of him being paid to do it, but quite likely because he was one of the quickest guys in the European karting championship at that time, and is the sort of guy you would pay if you had your son who was also a prodigy who says, oh well, the kart's not good enough, put Kubica in and see what would happen. So yeah, it would make sense because most of those guys were at 14 or 15. And it was the same with Nico Rosberg, Sebastian Vettel, pretty well all of the guys that are in that age group on the grid. They all came through karting and were on the road together. Guys like Charles Leclerc, they were all on the road together doing karting around Europe, all staying in hotels together and all the rest of it. So, yeah, absolutely. It does not surprise me at all.
It's such a shame that eventually in 2010 he had his very, very unfortunate rally crash. But had that not happened, there have been rumours swirling around that Robert would have been offered a potential seat at Ferrari to partner alongside Fernando Alonso for 2011. Now, I don't know how legitimate that would have been, but in that sense, assuming that would have happened, how do you think he would have stacked up with Fernando Alonso or even the other stalwarts of that early 2010 era, like Jenson Button, Lewis Hamilton, or even Sebastian Vettel? Because for many, he's one of the very highly rated drivers that never really got a chance to prove it in a World Championship winning car. But do you think he was good enough to compete with those lot of drivers who we now know as legends of the sport?
I think absolutely Robert Kubica had the ability to be a world champion. There's no two ways about it. He was only just starting on his winning streak. He was and remains an intensely competitive individual. I think it's a talent loss. It would have been very interesting to see what would have happened if Robert from Poland, of course, that area of Northeast Europe, what would have happened with F1 in that area if Robert had been able to stay on and likely would have gone to Ferrari, I think. He is very much experienced at living in Italy. He spent some time there in the past. And in fact, when he was doing his physio, I bumped into him at Bologna Airport one day because he was working with an Italian physio at that time. And he's definitely would have fitted in well with Ferrari, and it could easily be in a Ferrari world champion. I'm not entirely sure what Robert is doing now. I think he's working in the paddock still with some TV companies, but I haven't seen him around for a little while.
Yeah, it's such a shame what eventually happened. I think Robert's now working as an ambassador for the Rocket mobile phone company. And again, they were the sponsors of Williams for a little bit, and then they went and they had a major legal saga. But no, I think Robert was representing them as one of their ambassadors back for the Eastern European market.
Yeah.
But that's Robert. Let's talk about another Canadian GP memory that we all have and we all love. Something a little more iconic and specific to the circuit. The Wall of Champions. And it seems, Steve, that for the last few years, the Wall of Champions hasn't quite claimed any champions so far. But what's the whole story behind it, and just how iconic is it to the Montreal circuit right here?
Well, it's coming up to 24 years this year since the Wall of Champion got its name, because it was the 1999 Grand Prix. That's the wall on the inside of Turn 13, of course. And that was the 1999 Grand Prix where Damon Hill slapped it into the wall, and then about 10 laps later Michael Schumacher did the same, and then the home hero Jacques Villeneuve did the same 5 laps after that. That's when he got the Wall of Champions. And of course Mika Hakkinen, there was also, this is another one for a good pub quiz as well, what record did Mika Hakkinen set when he won that Grand Prix?
Wait, what record? Wait, let me think, one sec. Surely has to be nothing to do with the lowest starting position, or What could it be?
Shall I put you out of your misery?
Actually, no, wait, 1 sec. You know what? Let's actually get a take of all the people in the audience. So, folks, if you know the answer, just type it in the chat. But I just can't seem to think what it must be.
Yeah, let's see if anything comes up on chat. Well, I'm going to do a five red lights on this one, because otherwise they will go on to Google and win it. So 5 red lights are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 red lights. We're on. We go. It was actually Mika was the first ever F1 driver to win a Grand Prix behind a safety car. The safety car was out on the last lap.
Wait, what? Are you kidding me?
No, I can't remember why the safety car was out, but I do have it still in my notes that Mika was the first one to win under a safety car.
You know what? That's... Oh, yeah. Wow, you learn something new every day.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense, because I think up until that point in time, the safety car was more or less useless.
Yeah.
Because if you had an accident on track, or if a car was parked up after a DNF, it would just be kept at the exit of the track, basically where the grass would be, and so there'll be nobody coming and picking it up. So essentially the race would still be green, just with the yellow flag and no real safety car. So that kind of makes sense. Let's see. I just hope that this weekend we also get just about that much of chaos, because we genuinely need a good race. And usually Montreal delivers, but this time especially, with so many other protagonists like Fernando Alonso and even the Mercedes cars looking good, we want a good race. But yeah, hopefully this one is a good one.
But yes, I'm really looking forward to next weekend's Grand Prix. Like I say, I won't be able to see it live myself, which is frustrating, but I'll catch up with it probably at somewhere like midnight or something. Oh, well, yes, I'm commentating on some vintage racing cars and aeroplanes. So it's at the Flywheel event in Bicester in Oxfordshire, yeah. So and there's some amazing cars coming out for that. There's Grand Prix Bugattis from the 1930s, Le Mans winning D-type Jaguars. I walked past a workshop yesterday there, and there was a 1967 AC Shelby Cobra being prepped for the race, making the most amazing noise. It's about ground shaking. So it's going to be good fun. I think the biggest car we have there is some called a Napier Bentley, which has a Napier aircraft engine in from about 1930s. 24 litres, that's 24,000 cc. Only has a two-speed gearbox, but with 650 horsepower at the back wheels, you only need 2 gears.
Wow, I think this one and also the 36-litre Brutus, I think these 2 cars we've seen and heard at the Goodwood Festival of Speed, and my word, do they make some noise. But hey, that's not a bad way to spend a weekend, Steve. But even then, when you come back after all of that and look at the racing on Sunday, there still will be so much to excite you on Sunday evening, because at the Canadian GP, I'm particularly excited about how that midfield muddle between Alonso, Hamilton, the Ferraris, and also even Lance Stroll potentially goes about in his home race. But more than that, is there anything else that also excites you? Perhaps someone like Zhou Guanyu, who's very randomly either P9 or qualifying in P19 or something like that. It's just the closeness for me that makes it so exciting. But what really stands out for you, Steve, this weekend?
Well, the closeness of the field is the simple reason why. We're seeing fields covered by 0.2 of a second in qualifying, and certainly that if you blink your eyes, that's 0.2 of a second. So blink your eye, 0.2 of a second, right? That 0.2 of a second made the difference between getting into the top 10 and being 12th or 13th, the last Grand Prix qualifying. So that's how closely packed these cars are. One little mistake, putting one wheel on a white line, putting a car over the curbs, will move you from potentially a top 5 position in qualifying to back end of the top 15. So that's how closely packed it is. Zhou Guanyu is definitely a feisty racer. There's no other way you could describe him. And it doesn't seem to matter to him whether he starts 10th or 15th. He'll still work his way up into the points if he has a half a sniff of it. I think that technically Aston Martin should be good here. Ferrari, that straight line speed thing we talked about earlier, is possibly going to hurt them on that long back straight, particularly with DRS. And I still think DRS is the work of the devil. because I do think that it's a total blind alley to have an artificial means of reduction drag. What they should be doing is just making all the wings smaller and say to the drivers, cope with longer braking areas. If you had longer braking areas, you'd have more overtaking. So I do think the cars are still generating way too much downforce and way too much turbulence. If you put a teeny weeny front wing on the cars like an Indy car has, you'd end up with better racing, because actually you couldn't have a huge, great rear wing generating loads of drag. So you'd put a smaller wing on, get better straight line speed, longer braking areas, more overtaking. I still don't understand. I think the problem is the teams have spent so many $1 million on aerodynamicists and computational fluid dynamics and all that malarkey that actually sometimes it gets in the way of racing.
It's interesting you mentioned that. And that just makes me wonder about this whole question that's in my head, right? Which is, what is Formula One meant to be at the end of the day? Is it meant to be a spectacle where manufacturers showcase all their engineering prowess, or at the end of the day, a good TV product? Because in my head, you need the latter more than the former, because at the end of the day, why would people turn in? Sure, the manufacturers definitely help adding a bit of pizzazz to it, but you need a quality product, and that's what gets me confused about what Formula One is meant to be, Steve.
I personally go for the latter. The problem is when you've got car manufacturers spending tens of millions of dollars, they rule the roost. They want technical perfection. But actually, I think that the problem is at the moment, if you were to paint a Williams in Ferrari colours, which would you be able to tell them apart? You can't even. And certainly, if you drove past, you could not have a Ferrari and a Williams or a Mercedes drive past and say, I recognise the difference. That has been missing from F1 now for about 2 decades. They've become very much people spending millions of dollars to change the last percent. Don't necessarily knock all of it, because some of it is fantastic. There was a very good question earlier on. I think it was Samkit, was it, that was asking about, will we move to a pure electric racing car in some time in the future? Well, of course, we've got Formula E already. But I think the hybrid cars are fine. But I personally still do very much miss the sound of multi-cylinder engines, the sound of very high revving engines. And dare I say it, one of the joys of historic racing cars is actually watching guys fighting with H-section gear changes as well, gearbox gates. You can make a mistake if you get it wrong under pressure, that's for sure. So all of that stuff is still out there. But I think technology for me, and maybe I'm old-fashioned, but technology for me is a part of it, but shouldn't be all of it.
Hey, speaking of technology, Formula One have invested so many $1 million into partnering up with AWS and also trying to create this new generation of modern Formula One cars that are meant to be better in terms of racing. But Kevin has asked a very, very realistic question, and he's saying that why does this year the overtaking feels lessen compared to last year? Do they have to change anything with the regulations to make sure that we get more action? And I agree with him. The overtaking, well, we are getting closer battles this year, yes. But of course, overtaking is much, much trickier. Not that overtaking makes a good race, but you definitely need some to ensure that we get better battles. And that, I think, quite clearly is missing right here, Steve, these days.
Well, of course, that's going on. And I think I do agree with, I think it was Canal, wasn't it? Kevin, sorry. I do rather agree with him that the overtaking does appear to have been less, and when you get overtaking, it's generally artificial using the DRS. Part of that is, again, the cars are now cornering so fast, sometimes that you're talking about a braking area of 0.8 of a second into a corner. At Silverstone, they will run down Hanger Straight and into Stowe Corner. They actually start turning in before they start braking. That's how much downforce you got. That's how much braking force you've got. And where are the overtaking zones when you do that? You've got technology that's removed the overtaking zone.
Yeah, it's so true. Not that you need 1 million overtakes to make a race good, but somewhere something. And yeah, it seems to be missing at this moment in time. I think the only times we've seen a brilliant race is in conditions where grip really starts to get low and driver starts to struggle. I mean, think back to all the great races that you remember from the last half a decade or so. And most of them just end up being wet races. Hockenheim 2019, this past Monaco Grand Prix as well. So many other wet races that come to mind. Of course, there are a couple here and there like Brazil 2021 where Lewis Hamilton really flew past and had an incredible one. Or Abu Dhabi 2021, where you had a championship decider or something like that. But most races I remember happen to be in the wet where the grip is just not there, which is where I think drivers can really show their skill.
If it's a damp track, if you got a wet track, that could be the main thing. And actually, dare I say it, it's what brought Monaco to life. It's what brought Spain to life. Bernie Eccleston once said he was going to consider putting sprinklers on the side of every track and firing them off randomly. I don't think we could go to that artificial. But what I would say is, again, once you remove some of that grip level, you get racing. And I think actually ultimately we'll see some really interesting racing going on. But yeah, that's, Canada has been known to have rain in this time of year. I'm not quite sure what the forecast is yet. For my friends in the paddock, I don't really want to have to walk around in Wellington boots and raincoats, but equally we might just see something. It's an interesting one because you've got the back section of the circuit with a series of curves that one goes into the other, very technical. Then you've got that long straight down to the back of the pits. So it isn't a great overtaking circuit normally, but DRS is probably going to provide us with some of that. I'll probably be proved completely wrong now once we get into the race next week.
And you know what, Steve? Rain is forecasted for this weekend.
Well, that'll be fun. That will be fun. Can I just answer Ajith? What's my take on the new sprint format? A Grand Prix should be a Grand Prix. It is a Grand Prize. It's a long race. It's not Le Mans. It's just long enough to stay interesting. The sprint format is great, but have we actually seen any great racing in any of the sprint races so far? I'm not convinced that it's actually delivered anything more than just a short taster on a Saturday afternoon.
I think in its older format, it definitely was a lot worse than what we have right now. Again, with more points right now, there's a greater incentive for drivers to push on. But nevertheless, with such limited opportunities to overtake or at least close up a little bit to cars, it feels a lot like a parade at times.
A bit more than a parade, and the drivers are giving it everything, I'm sure. But the simple fact is that I don't think it's added to the racing element of Formula One. But it does give us something else to watch on a Saturday afternoon.
Apart from the classic Saturday afternoon football, isn't it?
Well, I'm not a Manchester City supporter, so I'm not celebrating at the moment.
Hey, actually, that reminds me. Do you watch football very often, Steve? And if you do, which club do you normally support? I'm big on United. I know we have a couple of listeners listening in who are big on Arsenal as well, and I disagree. But which is your favourite club?
I really don't support any one. A little bit, quite keen on. I love the passion that Liverpool have. They're like the Ferrari of the Premier League, in that you really want them to win, but they seem to find new ways of not doing it. Man City have been absolutely dominant this season, of course. Originally, I'm from the north of England, so I should support Newcastle United, really. But you can only take so much pain in your life.
No. It's changing. This year, Newcastle are getting just so much better. It's actually scary how good they might be next year as well. But let's get back to Formula One, actually. And speaking of Man City and their domination, let's get to Red Bull, because Ankit here has thrown in a very good question about Max Verstappen and his dominance. And do you think it wears off the charm of the sport? I think, Steve, we'd all be lying if we said that wasn't the case, right? But does it ruin the charm for you just a little bit?
No, I've got to agree with Ankit, and it was the same in the Michael Schumacher domination era. But there were always ones where the ball got dropped, and you're waiting to see what happens if there's a slip up. Max isn't perfect; he's a human being. He's a bloody good human being. That has got to be said in terms of his winning ability. But there is always that. There's always what can Sergio Perez do in the same car? Can he find a way of getting up to speed and matching him? Will there be an error made by somebody in the team somewhere, a statistician or a guy in the pit crew dropping the wrench or something like that? You never know. And that is the beauty of Formula One. We still start a Formula One Grand Prix, even if Max is on pole position by half a second. You're never entirely sure whether he's going to get through that first corner unscathed. You're never entirely sure whether he'll get through his first pit stop unscathed. Or will somebody come up with a better strategy? Or will it start to rain at the wrong time? Or will somebody bring out the safety car? You can never tell. And that's the beauty of Formula One.
Yeah, that's true. But Red Bull are so impeccable these days that it seems almost impossible that they'll make even one single error. But let's wait and see on that as the weekend and the season progresses. But Steve, here's a really special question from Mayur. And before I go into it, Mayur, you've nailed it, my friend. The sentiments are absolutely echoed 100%. He says, "Hi Steve, first of all, big fan. I miss your commentary in F1 races. Good to hear your voice again, and it brings back so many memories." So true. My question is, during the time you were commentating in the races, which was your favorite race and your favorite duel which you enjoyed commentating? Oh, that must be a tough choice.
Of circuits, the two circuits that I love are Spa, the Belgian Grand Prix venue, and Monza. Imola also has a very special atmosphere. And I hope that everything comes back together to allow an Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix to either be held later this season or into next. But certainly Monza has a passion and a feeling. It's chaotic. Just getting in and out of the circuit itself is an adventure. It used to be that you have to go and pick your media passes up from the local infant school in the town. It's everything about it is sort of like it's like they've always just done it for the first time. But then they've been running the Grand Prix there since 1923. It's coming up to its centenary. I do love a Spa just because it is the ultimate racetrack, and then you can throw in the weather. And the fact that Spa can have three different sorts of weather in three different locations on the track at the same time, and that's before I start drinking the Belgian beer. For me that is a great circuit. Individual races, crikey, there's so many now that I'm not entirely sure I could pick on one race. I suppose the ultimate race has to have been the Brazilian Grand Prix when Felipe Massa thought he was world champion. Lewis Hamilton got past Jarno Trulli on the last lap. Karen Chandok and I. If anyone has the recording of that, listen to the last few minutes and you'll hear us burst out laughing. And the reason is we were working off the monitor in a studio in London for that one. We got onto that last lap and Karen and I are shouting at each other in the commentary box, let alone commentating. And you'll hear us burst out laughing as Hamilton takes the checkered flag. The reason is that we both looked at each other and realised that as we got closer and closer to the screen, we were both on our hands and knees on the desk trying to get closer to the screen. And for me, that is still one of the great Grand Prix. That's what the Grand Prix should be about.
Yes. I so vividly remember the two of you absolutely losing it as I was watching. And wow, I was only 5 at that time, and still it's one of the best memories I have. That one, and also Abu Dhabi 2010 that you folks covered, and then Brazil 2012 as well. The championship finale, Steve.
Oh, yes.
You and your crew were just so good at that.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, if we don't get excited, how can we expect anyone else to? But Formula One is doing quite well without me, I think. So this is actually 10 years since I did my last full season with Star Sports. So it is quite scary. Time's passed very quickly.
No, Steve. It would just be that little bit better if we had you commentating as well. But I don't think your relationship with Formula One is by any means over and done, is it?
Oh yeah, well I've still been doing. I was still working. Been working until COVID around the F1 paddock on occasion. I'm still doing bits and pieces here and there, and of course I've been pursuing my other love of flying and vintage aeroplanes. And in fact, in a few minutes' time, I'll be leaving to fly that little yellow aeroplane that's just over my right shoulder. So I think that I'm. Certainly, I can look back on my time with F1 and be really proud of what we achieved. Bear in mind that when I started in F1 in '99, for Star Sports, that is, we didn't really have a footprint for Formula One anywhere in Asia. There was a little bit in Malaysia, we introduced India to Formula One, or Formula One to India. I'm not quite sure which way around you put that. And even today, even though there isn't a dedicated broadcaster in India at the moment, it's just, I'm very proud of the fact we were able to introduce India to this fantastic sport.
And we're so grateful to you and the entire crew for that. I mean, we have so many memories with you and the entire crew. You, Chris Goodwin, Paula Malayali, we had Matthew Marsh as well, Sanjeev Parler, and of course, one of our very good friends and listeners, Kurt Morris, has sent in a question on social media about Alex Young as well, and also asking how is Alex doing these days. Do you often chat with him, Steve?
Well, I would come down to Singapore on a regular basis, and I saw Alex. Alex was also spending quite a bit of time in Europe with Caterham F1 and various other projects that he was involved with. So I used to see Alex quite a bit. I haven't seen Alex now for about 5 or 6 years, although we stay in touch via the internet. And Matthew Marsh is still obviously very much involved with Star Sports. I see Karan Chandok on occasion, particularly bump into him at tests. He's been doing some testing with the Williams historic car fleet recently and doing shakedowns of some of their museum cars. And I see other members of the team, or stay in touch with other members of the team. In fact, I'm actually due to, I think later this year, we might see if we can find an excuse to come out to Malaysia and Singapore and take a bit of a holiday and go around and meet a few of my old mates.
Oh, yes, we'd so badly want that to happen. But hey, actually, we were on the subject of some Canadian GP stories, and there's one really interesting one that pops up in my head, Steve. And that was the time when Nigel Mansell actually lost the Canadian GP from the lead because he ended up celebrating a bit too early. Do you remember that one?
Yeah. It was back in 1991. I was actually at that time doing PR work with the Canadian brewer Labatt, who I was doing the PR for their touring car racing team in Britain. And they also were just about to go on to the Williams F1 car, and Labatt then moved into F1 sponsorship. And in fact, we were also working with a Canadian Formula 3000 driver at that time called John Jones. And I was doing the PR for that with the team Labatt's Jackie Stewart Racing, or Paul Stewart Racing in Formula 3000. So I was very much involved around it. Nigel let the revs drop at the hairpin, busy waving to the crowd, got distracted. A definite blooper. But basically, everybody said he stalled the engine. That's not entirely true. The Honda F1 engine, I think it was, that was in the back of the Williams at that time. Was it Renault? Must have been Honda. Was running, had its alternator system has to be kept running at about 6,000 RPM. Otherwise, the volts dry off. And that slow lap had drained the battery. He let the alternator drop below its critical level. It kicked out and the ignition died. Everyone said he'd hit the ignition switch with his hand while he was waving. No, it wasn't the case. It was the alternator had died. Either way, the engine stopped. And Nelson Piquet, who of course had been his deadly rival the previous couple of years, went on to take the victory. And Nelson always very famously refused to say he was sorry for Nigel for having thrown it away. But the other blooper, the one I always remember also, was the blooper, and I'm trying to look at my notes here to try and catch what year it was, which was when, I think it's 2008, when Lewis Hamilton, who'd been leading the race, everyone dived into the pits behind a safety car, and Lewis, they held the cars at the end of the pit lane to allow the safety car to come through, and Kimi Räikkönen stopped at the end of the pit lane, and Lewis tail-ended him, writing off both their cars and their chances for the race. And then just to add to good measure, Nico Rosberg drove into the back of Hamilton as well in the Williams. So, yeah, that was another good blooper for Canadian Grand Prix.
What a classic moment. And that led to Robert Kubica's only ever Formula One win.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And BMW's only ever win as well.
Yup, the good old days of Formula One. But hopefully we have a lot more of them coming along soon as well with some really good racing. But hey, I see we have a few more audience questions here.
Can I just quickly answer Maya's question as well, working with Chris Goodwin? Yeah, great guy to work with. I haven't seen Chris for a little while now. He's actually moved on from McLaren and he's head of chassis design and handling design for Aston Martin road cars. So if you've got an Aston Martin, it goes around corners all right. Thank Chris Goodwin.
Good old Chris. I think if I'm not wrong, Steve, he was also a test driver for McLaren, wasn't he?
test driver, and then he went to chassis design for the road car division, and then he moved across to Aston Martin. So.
Steve, that must also mean that Chris was there at McLaren when they created the MP412C, right? That car used to corner like a dream from all the people I've heard driving it.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did test driving with the MP412C, and he drove the two-seat F1 car. And I think it can be whispered these days because it's a few years since they did it. There were a number of times he donned a white helmet and white overalls to be the Stig for Top Gear as well. Well, briefly, yeah, there were a number of people with the Stig. I think even Lewis Hamilton had a go once just for a laugh.
Hang on, I didn't know about the Lewis Hamilton part. I definitely did know about Michael Schumacher though. But Chris Goodwin as the Stig. Wow, that's news to me.
Yeah, there's been a number of Stigs. And as you'd imagine, but Chris was there testing McLarens at the time, so if they needed a quick driver to drive something quick, put the white overalls on. I'm probably letting out a secret I shouldn't have there, so you'll have to bloop this bit.
You bet we won't, Steve. No, but on a serious note, it's so amazing that we've had you on the Inside Line F1 podcast once again, Steve. It's so refreshing to hear your voice once again and just to hear your perspective on Formula One. So honestly, thank you. Thank you so much for taking out the time to actually join us on the Inside Line F1 podcast. And before we leave, can you just give us your thoughts on the weekend ahead and just what you feel at the end of this amazing hour of talking Formula One with you?
Absolutely loved this. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's joined in and fired the questions across. I'm sorry I couldn't catch up with all of them fast enough. But, I think Connell and I are working on coming back and doing a few more on occasion. So hoping that will be that can be done. And just remember that Lewis Hamilton last won the Canadian Grand Prix back in 2019. That was his 7th Canadian Grand Prix win. There's only him and Michael Schumacher had won 7th. I would not be surprised if Lewis Hamilton does not come out on top next weekend and make it win number 8.
Oh, Steve, that is a bombshell. That is a proper bombshell.
Well, you've got an improving Mercedes. You've got Lewis Hamilton with a real challenge on his hands. Why not?
If that happens, Steve, it'll just make it the best weekend of Formula One action ever. But fingers crossed, we need some degree of drama. But seriously, once again, thank you for taking out the time to join us on the Inside Line F1 podcast, Steve.
Thank you.
And also a huge thank you to all of our live audience members who also tuned in for this live recording. And also to every single listener who's going to be completing this episode when it goes out on air as a recorded one. Seriously, thank you for taking out the time to listen to us. And we'll be back with more on the Inside Line F1 podcast with the Canadian GP review. So stay tuned and remember to subscribe to the podcast and share it with any friends or family members who might like it as well. See you until then, folks. Bye-bye and take care.